Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Serious Sam 3 BFE for PC, Mac, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360. This review is coming to you courtesy of Lord Chaos. He sent me this, so thank you. It is greatly appreciated. This is actually the prequel to First Encounter. The BFE stands for Before First Encounter. But it's the follow-up to Serious Sam 2. So it's Serious Sam 3 Before First Encounter. It's weird. But, suffice to say, it is technically the fourth game in the Serious Sam series, if you count Second Encounter as one of the games. Crow Team developed it, Devolver Digital published it, and it's an interesting game, not only because of the weird naming and numbering thing, but because Serious Sam 2 wasn't really very good. It didn't feel like a Serious Sam game, whereas they decided to try to bring that back with Serious Sam 3. And as a result, it's much less cartoony, and they've decided to go for a few other things here and there. They've tried to improve the gameplay somewhat by adding in some new features and such like that. But the real question is, does it really bring back the feel of First Encounter? Or does it do something entirely different, or what? Well, before we answer that question, let's talk about the presentation, which is running on the newest version of the Serious engine. It still has the very, very large open environments that you saw in stuff like the First Encounter, but they seem smaller, so they did tone down that somewhat in exchange for a higher visual fidelity in terms of texture quality, as well as much smoother modeling, that sort of thing. So it's a give and take kind of thing. So as far as the visual quality goes, surprisingly good textures. They're fairly high res, although they could be better. Modeling is very well done. Very few jagged edges on anything, and everything looks quite nice. The animations are kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, they seem a lot like First Encounter's animations to some degree, but they're smoother, and they flow together more nicely, so that's a good thing. As far as the visual style goes, there's a problem, and they tried to make it more like the First Encounter by making it a more realistic look than Serious Sam 2, which was just completely cartoony. This one, on the other hand, almost feels like it's trying to be brown and grey and realistic, which it's not. But if you don't turn the saturation up on the colors, then you really do notice that it looks like just another modern FPS, and it doesn't look appealing to the eye at all. If you turn the saturation up, you'll notice that there is certainly color in there, but it's nowhere near as much as there was in First Encounter, or especially Second Encounter. Or you take it even a step further and you go to Serious Sam 2 with the colors, they were off the charts. But with this one, it has a distinct lack of color, and that makes the visuals rather unappealing, even though they are pretty high quality. And for some reason, performance in this game isn't as good as the previous games when they came out, which is odd to say the least. I even have a friend whose PC is much more powerful than mine, and he outright told me that it doesn't run all that well in his system either. So I don't know what's going on with the visuals in this game, but they seem to not have as good performance as the previous games in the series, even on more beefy systems. So I don't know what's going on there. I don't know whether they can patch it out or not, but it is kind of an issue. As far as the sound design goes, they did a really good job with that for the most part. Most of the guns have a good sound to them, particularly the double-barrel shotgun sounds really beefy. And so you have this very nice audio going on with the weapons that you're using. But as far as the voice acting goes, it's average. You do have the ever wonderful voice of Sam, but the problem is that the lines he's saying just aren't as good as the previous games. So it's not quite as charming as it was in the previous games. Same goes for the rest of the voice acting. It's not really up to that level of charm that the First Encounter, Second Encounter had. And at least it's not as ridiculous as Serious Sam 2's voice acting, but still. The music, on the other hand, is really well done. It fits the game very well for the most part. They cranked up the metal in this one a lot more, and so it actually fits the game a lot better because it's that high octane battle going on and such like that. So you have a very good opportunity with that metal soundtrack, and they certainly pull it off. Although there is certainly some atmospheric stuff going on that fits the setting quite well as well. But ultimately, it's not the presentation that matters the most. Now, what really matters are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this one takes a bit more after Serious Sam 2 in one particular regard, and that is that they put more emphasis on it. Which is not what you're supposed to do in a Serious Sam game, and they're old school FPSs. The story isn't really supposed to matter all that much, but they really tried to push it on you in this one. And that's kind of annoying. Unlike in Serious Sam 2, where it was kind of ridiculous and just really trying too hard to be funny, this one seems like it's trying too hard to be serious. So there wasn't really any middle ground between those two games. They just went from incredibly silly to rather serious. And the tone of this game is actually not what you'd expect for a Serious Sam game. They've always been fairly lighthearted. I mean, they went way too far with the second one. But first and second encounter had a good sense of humor about them. They were very lighthearted. They were cartoony-ish, but they weren't too much so. This one, they tried to make it almost too realistic. So what ends up happening with the story in this one anyway? Well, once again, you're playing as Serious Sam Stone, and this is the events that lead up to the first encounter. It's humanity trying to power up the time lock and send people back in time to defeat Mental. And so what ends up happening is they basically retcon their story, and what ends up happening with the story in this one is it's Sam going up to power up the time lock, and how he does that, and then what happens after he powers it up. There's really not much in the way of a strong storyline in this game at all, and the cutscenes that they throw in there to really push the story forward really end up getting annoying. Simple reason is they interrupt the game too much. Now, you do have them at the beginning of levels and at the end of levels, but occasionally they throw them into the middle of levels, and you just sit there going, why? Why is there a cutscene here? This doesn't really belong here. And even then, there's way too many cutscenes in this game. You really just kind of want to run around blasting monsters. That's what Serious Sam's about, not storyline. But they kind of pushed it in this one, and as a result, it becomes a very almost overdramatic, cheesy, trying way too hard to be serious kind of storyline that just gets on your nerves after a while. Even though there's nothing inherently bad about the storyline itself. It's just the way it's presented ends up being annoying. But what about the gameplay? That's really what matters in this case. I mean, this is an old school style FPS, right? Well, yes and no. The core of the old school FPS is still there to some degree. You're still running around with most of the same weapons you had in the first encounter, actually. They did add in a couple different ones, like the Syrian Mutilator, the Sledgehammer, and so on. But they also kept most of the gameplay mechanics. I mean, you're still running around with those crazy, wacky weapons for the most part. You're still fighting huge hordes of enemies that just rush at you, and sometimes it's up to the hundreds of enemies on screen at once. The difference being that the engine doesn't handle it anywhere near as well as it did in Serious Sam First Encounter, Second Encounter, or even Serious Sam 2. I'm not really sure why, but it just doesn't seem to run as well. And that can be a big problem when you're fighting very, very large groups of enemies and your frame rate suddenly tanks. But you can muddle past it for the most part. The gameplay is still just how can you survive against these hordes, but they've done different things with it. In addition to adding in new weapons and a couple new enemy types, they also decided to throw in a couple different mechanics. The first of them is related to that sledgehammer. One of the mechanics with that is you can have a special attack with your sledgehammer. You have 3 different attacks with that thing. You can just do a vertical strike, a horizontal strike, or you can actually spin all the way around by pressing the reload button, which is kind of weird, right? But suffice to say, manual reloading is in this one, unlike it was in Serious Sam 2. That was a feature they only put into Second Encounter until now, apparently. But manual reloading is in there, and it's only on a couple of the weapons, namely the pistol and the assault rifle. although it is also on the shotgun as well. For some reason they decided to throw in reloading on the single shotgun. But suffice to say, there is reloading, and it becomes a problem if you're in very large engagements. You really want to pay attention to your ammo and make sure you're not running out, which isn't exactly something that happened in the previous games. Even though you did have some ammo shortage problems occasionally, for the most part you had plenty of ammo. And in this one you actually run into a lot more problems with ammo conservation. And so you'll be stuck with your pistol and your sledgehammer half the time. And in fact, there's one level toward the end of the game where they take away all your weapons and you have to get them all back. And I hate that level, because it showcases exactly what the big problem with the way they've designed the levels is. It's not that they're wide open areas with lots of enemies coming at you. That's fine. That's Serious Sam style. It's that they have engineered it so you have a lot more problems actually playing the game. And what I mean by that is the levels are designed in such a way as you get hubs, so to speak, of ammo and health items and armor items. And then it throws a huge horde of enemies at you, and you have to deal with that. And you are not always equipped to deal with that sort of thing. So it feels more like you have to get lucky in this game rather than rely on your skills like you were in the previous games. And in fact, there were several situations where my skills didn't even matter. I just happened to run out of ammo, or an enemy happened to get me from behind, or something like that, and eventually I would just get past that part by sheer luck. And that was kind of the main problem I had with the single player in this game. The gameplay is fine, actually. For the most part, it's that same Serious Sam experience you got in the previous games, except that they've added in a few different mechanics, like the sledgehammer, like a melee system where you can finish off certain enemies with a quick melee attack. It's usually not very practical in the game itself, but it's kind of cool to do occasionally if it's a lone enemy or something like that. They added in some variety with the way certain enemies are dealt with. I mean, some of them are actually immune to bullets, so you have to hit them with explosive weapons, and that can be a big problem if you're running out of ammo with those. But the big problem with the way they've designed the levels is that in a lot of situations you are not equipped to deal with what it's throwing at you. Whereas in the previous games, it would give you an item, and knowing what that item did and its strengths and weaknesses, they would tailor the situation to that. Whereas in this one, they don't really do that. Instead, they throw situations at you that they think you can handle, but you barely can. Now this is really noticeable late in the game, because they just ratchet up the difficulty all of a sudden. It's just a difficulty cliff, really. The entire game is pretty difficult, but when you get to the end few levels, basically the last 2-3 levels, suddenly you find that the difficulty has ratcheted up to such a degree you can barely handle the situations being thrown at you. And this was on normal difficulty, I might add. There are settings higher than that, and there's even settings lower than that. But it's not really fair difficulty like it was in the previous ones. Instead, it seems gimmicky. It seems like they just slapped these levels together and said, okay, how can we make this ridiculous? And then went with that. So, it's a really mixed bag. On the one hand, you have a lot of the gameplay actually being really fun, except when it throws the boring weapons at you, like tons of ammo for the assault rifle. Who wants that? And who wants to aim down the sights in a Serious Sam game? I mean, really. Luckily, there's only 2 weapons in the game that do that. But seriously. And then they also have the secret areas and levels where you can that's actually the only way you can find the sniper rifle and the laser rifle in or laser gun in the single-player campaign. You have to find them through secret areas. And I mean, that gameplay core is still there, but it's mutated, and it seems like they almost, not quite, but almost lost touch with what made Serious Sam great in the first place. So there is plenty to get out of Serious Sam 3 if you're a fan of the single-player portions of Serious Sam 1 and the first encounter and second encounter, or even Serious Sam 2 to some degree. But it just doesn't feel quite as strong as it did in the previous games. Well, what about the rest of the game? There's also survival mode, which is another single-player mode. It's basically just hold off against hordes of enemies as long as you can, and it gradually gives you weapons. It's nothing really to write home about. So there's not much to say there. But there's also 2 multiplayer modes, Versus and Co-op. And Versus is your standard stuff like Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch, Capture the Flag, that sort of thing. Whereas Co-op, of course, you're playing through campaign missions. And Co-op has always been one of the biggest strong points of this series. It has always had really good co-op. Except for in this one. Now, you may be wondering why that is. The simple reason for it is, you can have a lot of people playing on a co-op server. It's a much larger number than you're used to with co-op. You're used to maybe 4 players. This one goes, 4 times that. And what ends up happening is, the game becomes way too easy. Unless you put it on the absolute highest difficulty, in which case it becomes a challenge, but it's never really too difficult. Unlike in the single player, where the difficulty is ratcheted up to an incredible degree toward the end of the game. And it just is really jarring going from one to the other. For instance, when you're used to playing the single player and it being really hard, and you go to the co-op and suddenly you find that it's way too easy, there's a pretty big disparity there, and that gets rather jarring. But if you're playing it on the hardest difficulty, it's not quite as bad, but you do still notice that the game is much easier on co-op. And oddly enough, unlike the previous games, it's not quite as fun in co-op. Now, I couldn't really figure out why that is. I guess it was just because it was too easy in co-op when I managed to play it online. Because there's not really a lot of people playing this game online, let me tell you. But the co-op just seemed not quite as fun as the previous games. It wasn't bad, don't get me wrong, but that easiness didn't really help it out much. And then there's the Versus multiplayer. I don't really need to say too much about the Versus multiplayer because it is atrocious. It is incredibly unbalanced. For instance, the double-barrel shotgun is ridiculously overpowered in that thing. The maps are terrible. There are only technically 4 of them, but one of them is just a mutation of another one, where instead of having the variety of weapons that it normally has, it just has the shotguns. And they are all very rudimentary arenas, except for one of them, which is based on a single-player level, and it takes place in a town. But the problem is, they have a sun in there, and that blinds you. So there are moments in the single player as well where it does that, but it's very rare. Whereas on this map, it becomes a really big problem because you will be running around that map in circles and you will go across that spot where it blinds you from the sun. And so the multiplayer ends up actually being way more frustrating than the single player portion of the game, just because it's just so unbalanced and the maps are just so awful. It's a real shame, because there was the potential for some good Versus multiplayer, but they didn't really capitalize on that at all. And then if you're playing on one of the maps with Capture the Flag, you're going to have a really hard time seeing anything, so just don't bother. So you have this really mixed bag of a game. On the one hand, it has a lot of those same Serious Sam moments that you're used to, but they just seem like they didn't quite get it again. They didn't quite capture the magic of the first encounter. It makes a lot of jokes that just end up being stupid. It references back to the original game, of course, but not that much, and usually it just seems tacky. The campaign itself, for the most part, is okay, but that difficulty cliff at the end of the campaign really, really wears on you, and it gets infuriating at that point. Because at that point, the BS meter is incredibly high when you're sitting there just getting your ass handed to you by these hordes of clear skeletons. By the time you finish this game, you will hate clear skeletons, by the way. But you combine that with reasonably solid mechanics that they never really did anything to mess up. That was a very good thing. But you combine that with that, as well as really awful Versus multiplayer, and co-op that makes the game too easy, and you have a really mixed bag. So, what do I say about something like that? Well, Serious Sam 3 is certainly not a bad game. There was no indication of that when I was playing it. It certainly gets extremely infuriating at times, which was something that the previous games didn't do. Even though they would get frustrating, they never got infuriating. And that's mostly because of that difficulty cliff just all of a sudden out of nowhere, whereas with the previous games it was much more gradual. And you combine that with just all the different factors of this game, and while I can recommend it to some people, like if you're a fan of Serious Sam, you probably get something out of it. It's hard to give a universal recommendation. So, ultimately, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.